This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Cloud Communications Alliance. This is our second webinar of the year. We had our first one last week, second one this week. So we're 2 for 2 in 2022. We are going to be recording this event. We had a lot of people who registered to attend. A lot of people registered to attend so they can hear the recordings after the event. So we will share those with everybody, and we share them with you as well. But I want to thank you for joining us today. CCA has a bunch of events planned for 2022. We have several webinars, we have several in-person meetings planned, and we're going to be announcing those in the next several days. So keep an eye out for those, please. But today's session is all about cybersecurity. As service providers, we have an obligation to our customers to protect their data. Not only a moral obligation, but also a legal obligation. And we're going to talk a little bit about the legal stuff today. We're going to talk about some of the new regulations. We're going to talk about enforcement. We're going to talk about ways which you can mitigate your exposure to cybersecurity issues. And we're honored to have the crew from Pillsbury with us today. We have Tamara Bruno. We have Brian Finch. We have Reagan. Did I get that? Reagan. O'Riordan, Reagan O'Riordan. I hope I got that right. And we have Glenn Richards. So Pillsbury, thank you very much for helping us. Megan, not Reagan. I'm sorry, Megan. Thanks for joining us. And we have Glenn Richards from Pillsbury. Glenn's an old friend of the Cloud Communication Alliance. Glenn, thanks for putting this together for us today. As you see on your screen, you know the buttons already. You can mute yourself. You can show your video. Feel free to do so. If you have any questions, feel free to chat them throughout the session, and we will ask them. We'll pause several times throughout the session, but we'll also ask them as you chat them out to us. So feel free to chat any questions you might have. And now let me kind of take it away and turn over to Brian.
Great. So thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Honored to be presenting here today. We can skip all over my bio. It's embarrassing. I feel like my mom wrote it. My mom wrote it. She'd also put on there, she doesn't call enough. So I'm Brian Finch. I'm the co-chair of the cybersecurity and privacy practice here at Pillsbury, based in Washington, operating out of South Carolina, which is about 1,000 degrees warmer than where Megan is apparently in Minnesota right now. So it's a pleasure to be talking to you today. And it's really interesting. These are always fun conversations, which is kind of a weird thing to say when it comes to cybersecurity, given the threat that's out there. But it's always interesting to hear people's thoughts and communicate with them about what's out there, what the threats are, what the regulatory environment, which is becoming increasingly strict, looks like, and how you can manage that with some simple and not so simple tools, which Megan will talk about in terms of contractual issues, as well as Tamara with respect to insurance. But I'm here to level set a little bit when it comes to the cyber threat, and I think a lot of this will be elementary for some of you folks out there, but it's always worth discussing because it's just a reminder of how difficult the cybersecurity environment is these days. And what we're seeing in part, we can just talk about the threats over the last few months. For instance, this Log4j issue, where there was a vulnerability in some open source coding that has led to hundreds of thousands and millions of attempts to exploit that. And I know, for instance, the US government is extremely concerned about this, leading to exploits and large-scale hacking. And it's really what it's illustrative of more than anything else is that coding errors and vulnerabilities are everywhere. And when you talk to some of the leading lights on cybersecurity, whether they're in government or in the private sector, what they will tell you is that you don't have to be the most sophisticated vulnerability researcher. You don't have to be a nation state to understand how to quickly gain access to systems. What you really need to do is just pay attention to when vulnerabilities are announced, because often vulnerabilities are announced without a resolution, without a patch. And that's been an example with respect to Log4j. And so that gap, whether it's a couple of days, a week or two, or even sometimes hours between when the vulnerability is announced and when a patch is released or a fix is released, that's more than enough time for the adversaries who are sharp to go out and exploit those vulnerabilities and get into systems. You see it regularly. And we've talked, for instance, with Kevin Mandia, who's the CEO and founder of Mandiant, who talks about this and saying you don't really need what are so-called 0 days a lot of the time in order to attack systems, previously unknown flaws that haven't yet been exploited. You can just go out and take a vulnerability like Log4j, because patching isn't easy, as you all know, especially in a difficult and complicated environment like the cloud environment. It can take time, and especially when you're talking to owners of critical infrastructure, a patch isn't something you simply run and restart your computer. It can take weeks or months to implement because of the cascading effects. And so it's something I like to hold out as an example, is to say, that's what's grabbing the headlines on the news, but it's just another illustration of how difficult the cyber environment is and the threats that are out there. So if we go to the next slide, what we can talk about here as well is what are the consequences. And this, obviously, thankfully, the cloud environment is not gasoline. We're already having enough problems with gasoline and gasoline prices. But for those of you who remember about a year ago, and I'm sure many of you do, is that a pipeline here in the East Coast of the United States was shut down as a result of a ransomware event. And what was really interesting about this Colonial Pipeline incident, and what really caused the problem at the end of the day, it wasn't the ransomware itself, because the ransomware didn't affect the pipeline per se. It didn't affect any of the controls, the automation, the SCADA systems, et cetera. It actually only hit the billing systems within the Colonial. But what they were afraid of was that it would bleed over into that operational technology. And that fear led Colonial to shut down the entire pipeline network. And 45% of the gasoline that was moving on the East Coast in April and May just wasn't moved for about a week or so. That was bad news. And for some of you who were affected, you might remember there were supposed gasoline shortages. There were, in fact, a few shortages. There were some lines, et cetera, et cetera. Thankfully, nobody was killed. There was no life-threatening incidents. There were a couple of fist fights. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really the fact that the ransomware infected the control systems. It was just the fear. And what was the fear? The fear was the company didn't know whether it was going to hit that operational technology and whether it was going to spread or not. And that's what got Colonial in trouble. That's what Department of Homeland Security and others were very upset about, was the fact that Colonial didn't seem to know its own systems and didn't seem to know what to do when it should have known. And that led to compulsory regulations being issued by the Transportation Security Administration. And that, as this group knows, I'm sure, is the worst case scenario anytime, which is that you have some sort of disaster, some sort of emergency, and the response from government is to issue quickly drafted, poorly thought out regulations. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on the Transportation Security Administration saying they think poorly. It's just in that emergency amount of time, there isn't time for the notice and comment and thoughtful responses. It's just, let's get this out. And so there's been trouble in the implementation of those regulations that continues to this day. So it's a great lesson, and you definitely don't want to be caught in an emergency situation and have no plan for dealing with it.
And Colonial's kind of interesting too, right, Brian? Because even though obviously they're not a technology services provider in the traditional sense, they were a service provider. And I know that we're dealing with quite a few other clients in connection with claims arising out of this. Figuring out, to what extent they need to go after Colonial, if at all, to what extent they're otherwise covered with respect to, other risk mitigation they have on their own. So Colonial seems very interesting because even though it's, a physical asset infrastructure sort of service provider, they really are kind of a service provider. And that's had a lot of ripple add-on effects for the company itself, with its partners, in addition to the regulatory environment, obviously.
Right. And that's right, because as a friend of mine once said to me, listen, the internet doesn't surf itself, so everybody's on it nonstop. And when some of these cloud-enabled services, whether it is just sort of shopping or your phones or whatever the case may be, it goes down, it's noticed immediately. And so that general category of services is something that is carefully being paid attention to, especially in this Congress and with this White House. So the possibility of regulation and the development of regulation is on overdrive at this point, for sure. If we go to the next slide, we know that the cloud computing world is a target as well. We know, for instance, the Russians have been targeting cloud service providers. They have been doing this a number of times. Microsoft, the big beast of Microsoft, has seen its cloud environment hacked a number of times, and we're even seeing, we can talk about AWS all we want, but when we speak with law enforcement and incident responders on our end about what some of the challenges and where they see the most common vulnerabilities that are being exploited, it's misconfigurations, and it's not the operator. So it's not you all as members of the Cloud Alliance that are the ones that are at fault per se, but it's folks who are using your services. Sometimes they just don't implement it the correct way. And again, the adversaries, the hackers know that, and so they exploit that, and that's where we regularly see hacks coming into play, in addition to some of the fundamental flaws that may be underlying Azure or AWS or some of the other cloud environments that are out there. If we go to the next slide, what's also contributing to all this is the fact that Tamara, Megan, and I are not in our offices, and it's not just because we're doing work travel. It's because we're working from home, because our offices are effectively closed at this point, as is basically everybody's right now. And so that remote environment is thankfully being empowered and driven by folks who are members of this group, which is a great thing. And we've actually seen productivity rise, which is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, again, the adversaries know what's going on. They know that people are working remotely. Security is more difficult sometimes in these types of environments. And so we've seen a dramatic rise in attacks that are trying to utilize that remote environment where you're taking advantage of cloud-based services as a way to increase the threat surface and increase the number of successful intrusions. And you can see by these numbers of 400% increase in the number of cyber attacks, especially hitting small to medium-sized businesses. They're just really getting hammered. We get a call almost every other day now about people who are wiring money to the wrong location because of some sort of business email compromise, faked emails, hacked into email servers, et cetera. And so this, again, is another reason why cybersecurity is going to be a tremendous challenge ongoing for everybody in this group. If we go to the next slide, and I think it goes up to this day. We see Ukraine, poor Ukraine, as a Ukrainian of heritage of 100+ years ago. I always like to say the only more dangerous thing than being a Ukrainian is being a Ukrainian Jew. And once again, it's being proved true in this particular case. Because once again, Russia is taking a look at the Ukraine as a place for the crossroads into Europe and access to seaports, et cetera. And so they're facing potential military invasion, a good old boots on the ground, tanks rolling across the border, et cetera. But what is preceding that? Cyber attacks. And we see that Ukrainian infrastructure, including the cloud, is once again under attack by the Russians. And this is after years and years of people knowing that Ukraine is going to be subject to attacks. If we all remember NotPetya, for instance, and I know there was just a good decision about that on the insurance side, which Tamara could probably talk about, but the NotPetya ransomware, quote unquote, attack of a few years ago was actually an attack on the Ukraine that accidentally spilled over the borders and went worldwide. And so when you see these types of events coming in, the impacts, particularly as it hits IT infrastructure in the cloud, it's something we all need to pay attention to. And if we go to the next slide, another area that I'll just mention briefly are some of the legal obligations that are out there. And so just moving quickly into that, we see a number of states expanding the definition of personal information. We've got California, which you're all familiar with. New York has a similar personal data protection law. There's biometric data protections. Everybody on this call is familiar with this because you deal with all this personal information, but it's not the good old days where personal information was someone's credit card, a password, and a home address. Now it's everything from biometrics to IP data, and the failure to protect all of that information, including data that you maintain or provide, could well lead to privacy violations and lawsuits from both government officials, regulators, as well as private enforcement, private litigation, which can get very expensive. Every single day we see, for instance, a new lawsuit in Illinois, class action about violation of this Biometric Privacy Act. So it's a challenge. And we go to the next slide. What we're also seeing is that Treasury has issued updates on risk with respect to making payments for ransomware, and also in the SEC as well has been developing and enforcing a requirement for robust cybersecurity and disclosure of cyber attacks. It's going to be important that when you're looking at your potential regulators, including if you're a public company or if you have any SEC reporting obligations, make sure you understand what you're doing from a cyber perspective and how you're protecting data and whether you're adequately disclosing this. Failing to do so is leading to a lot of tough questions. Excuse me, we're dealing with a lot of questions right now, document requests from the SEC related to solar winds. And if you're seeing that, you know that for Log4j and another, whatever attack follows, no matter how tangentially you're involved, you're going to be getting request letters and demand letters from the SEC. So it's something to be very careful about and make sure that you have your documented policies and procedures in place. Go to the next slide. I mentioned earlier the TSA response. We also see that there's legislation pending on data breach notification, as well as ransomware notification, other issues like software bill of materials, supply chain, et cetera. All that's going to hit you and hit your customers, and you're going to be involved. And I didn't even mention here, if any of your customers are government, federal government, you get swept into the Defense Department's acquisition regulations, where you, as a potential subcontractor to, let's say, a Boeing or a Raytheon or some of these other government contractors, you're going to be required to follow some very rigorous cybersecurity obligations as well. And if you're not aware of that and think you might be, it's something to definitely look into. And even if not, you want to double check, because the way the DoD is going to enforce that is pretty serious, and it could either cost you in terms of regulatory work or cost you in terms of not winning contracts because you're not following the right cybersecurity requirements as dictated by Defense Department requirements, even if you never even thought of yourself as a DoD contractor. Next slide. I mentioned the SEC earlier, so I think the important point here is that they're vigorously enforcing cyber disclosures. The Justice Department has also put together a task force headed by the Deputy Attorney General on cyber fraud and government contracting. So you get the 1-2-3 punch of the SEC, the Justice Department, and the Defense Department, all focusing on cyber issues. And boy, that's all something you really need to be thoughtful about and just be very careful at the end of the day. So go to the next slide, Glenn. I think what we can do there's my brief tour de force, and I'll now turn it over to Megan, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about cyber standards and contracts.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. I guess before we move into my phase, I think, are there any questions on Brian's content? I think when we let off, we want this to be as interactive as possible in the online forum. So to the extent you have questions, we're going to pause at a few points to take those questions, or you can always use the chat function as well. And if there's nothing, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to ask a quick question relating to sort of our industry, MySpace, which was in terms of how we construct our propositions. If we keep things like voice and meeting applications separate, does it make us a less viable target for ransomware providers? You know, if you can't shut me down from speaking to my customers in total, is it worth trying to take me on? How does that work?
So segmentation, as they call it, is always a good idea at the end of the day, and that's one of the fundamental. I wouldn't necessarily say fundamental, but it's an important security control that you can implement, and we encourage that. We do it at our own law firm, for instance, and trying to segment different systems, because the way ransomware works, obviously, is once it gets in, it spreads throughout the system. And if there is that sort of gap between those system and internal defenses that prevents that internal movement or lateral movement, as the experts call it, then yes, it makes you less vulnerable to ransomware. I wouldn't say it makes you less attractive, because I don't know that the attackers are necessarily going to know that you've done that. But what it does is that it makes you less vulnerable, so that if you do suffer a ransomware attack, you can continue operations uninterrupted while you deal with that and let your voice and other capabilities go forward. And it's important, I think from our perspective as lawyers, we're not dispensing technical advice. My advice is usually restart it or drop it and see if it works. And then if not, I call the help desk. But when it comes to that situation, documenting what you're doing with respect to those types of controls and showing that you have them in place from a legal and a regulatory perspective, that's what's really helpful, because you can say, yes, we had that in place. Somehow they defeated it. So it's not like we weren't meeting the basic standard of care or even an advanced standard of care. We were just dealing with a really good adversary. And that's, I think, a really critical point at the end of the day, which I always emphasize, is that, look, we live in this world now known as zero trust, meaning that you have to assume not only that you're under attack, but that somebody's in your system and they're successfully in there. So you can't just focus on keeping them out. You have to keep the focus on quickly remediating the problem and continuing operations. And so penetration into your systems is not an automatic sign of failure. The ability to recover quickly and continue on and having the plans for that is what really defines a successful cyber operation.
Thank you.
But Brian, I love that phrase, we live in a world of zero trust. That makes me feel really good. But one of the things that we're experiencing here at the Cloud Communications Alliance, or our members, are distributed denial of service attacks. You talked a lot about ransomware, but just tuck that in the back of your mind. But the DDoS attacks are causing us a lot of angst these days.
Yeah, and that's very much a technical issue that can be solved, obviously, with some cooperation with law enforcement to hit the servers that are really controlling a lot of those attacks, as well as internal technical solutions. A good friend of mine used to be the chief technical officer for a very large cable company. So he was the engineer keeping evil trains running on time, if you will, for those evil cable companies, which of course I consume 22 hours of the day. But he would talk about that, and he always said, the faster internet is great because it means that there's going to be even more intense cyber attacks at the end of the day. And from DDoS specifically, just like you were talking about. So yeah, I think that is important, and you do see that pretty regularly with respect to, whether it's in Eastern Europe or a lot of these other attacks, or these DDoS attacks can overwhelm websites. It's very important, and you don't want to minimize the threat. It can be extremely disruptive, especially from a commerce perspective. The plus side, if you will, of DDoS attacks is that the damage that is done isn't as extensive as ransomware or data theft. Once it's mitigated, you're in relatively good shape and you can continue your operations. It's these other threats that are out there that once they get into systems and they exfiltrate information or destroy information or systems, that becomes the significant problem. But for you all, absolutely, DDoS continues to be a significant problem. Fortunately, there's a lot of cooperation that goes on between law enforcement and the telcos and you all in order to make sure that you can have operations resilient and running as much as possible.
Yeah. Just one correction. I mean, a real world correction is that we found law enforcement not that helpful. We reached out to them and they didn't know what we were even talking about, to say the truth. So we decided as Cloud Communication Alliance, we're going to try to put together our own mitigation routine.
Well, so thank you for that correction. I would say that you're 100% right about that. Because I've had any number of people who come to us and say, we called the FBI and we didn't get an answer. Exactly. They don't care. When I say, and this is not to brag about anything that we do in particular, there are plenty of organizations like this, so take it with that caveat. If you have a good relationship with law enforcement in advance, if you have people that that you can rely upon, they can be helpful in those particular circumstances. It's when you haven't done the effort to build a relationship. Actually, in my case with the Secret Service, I work well with them. I find them much better than the FBI to deal with, or others. Let's say at Homeland Security. If unfortunately, if you know the right people, you can get help. If you are just dialing cyber 911, you're in a world of hurt in that case.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, terrific. I think we'll move on to the next segment here. My name is Megan O'Riordan. I'm a partner with Pillsbury, colleagues with Brian and Tamara and Glenn. My practice covers, I'm part of our global sourcing and technology transactions practice. And my day-to-day work involves negotiating, structuring, and helping to manage large-scale services and technology agreements, both on the customer side and I do have several service provider-focused clients as well. But I really enjoy speaking to audiences like this, in that the bulk of my practice is on the customer side, giving you the perspective from the customers. So when you're going out and contracting, where they're coming from and their viewpoints on a number of these terms. But then also that open dialogue, hearing from you as well is so important and terrific. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes going through, when we're looking at procuring services, cloud services, and so forth from the customer vantage, those things that customers are looking at, and then when we look at that, we'll kind of talk about that and framing that from your perspective as well. So next slide. Okay, so when should cyber terms be a priority in a services or cloud or technology agreement? I mean, this is almost a rhetorical question. So it is always, regardless of the industry that you are selling into or working with, the cyber always, somehow those issues always percolate to the top of the top 5 priority lists in these agreements that everyone has a concern about. Just by way of a small anecdote, I'm actually doing an agreement right now where I am on the service provider side of a deal, selling into a franchised food enterprise. And you would think, hey, why would cyber, other than credit cards and things like that, be of significant concern? But it is the number 1 priority and topic, and that goes all the way through, as you can imagine, banks, healthcare institutions. It just gets increasingly important and higher profile. So it is, when we are working with companies, typically, like I said, the critical or top critical element in an agreement that they are looking to tackle and make sure their risks are protected. The trends in contracting related to cyber that we have seen, for the longest time, it was about response, right? Let's make sure, and as we just heard from Brian's discussion, response is critical, and that has become table stakes almost. The expectation that your technology partners and the customer are able to easily and quickly respond and deal with that appropriately, that's an expectation that just, typically I don't even see some of that negotiated now. There is an expectation that happens. Where we have seen movement and change is the notion of prevention. So how do you build preventative measures between customers and service providers into a contractual setting so that we're never in that response mode? The old notion, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Let's figure out ways up front that we can frame our relationship and set up the procurement of the technology and the ongoing maintenance and management of it so that we have mitigated to the extent we can any type of circumstance. So there's a heavy focus on what's known as TPRM now, third-party risk management. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that and probably have been subjected to your customers' TPRM processes. And across the industry, those processes are maturing at varying rates, particularly in the financial institutions and financial services sector. They're much more mature than in other sectors. And what the implications for yourselves is that you will be forced, I say forced through the ringer, but forced through a varying degree of rigor at not only the upfront entry point of a relationship of the contracting process, but to the extent companies have matured their TPRM processes, this will be an iterative process throughout the life cycle of the procurement of the relationship, whereby not only are we setting standards up front and the two parties are setting standards and holding one another to those standards, but those standards are getting updated and changed and are dynamic as threats change, the environment changes, the laws change, so that by the time we hit year 5 or year 10 of the relationship, the cyber standards and the security standards between the parties have evolved and they're no longer static, and we're and everybody's in a tough spot. So next slide, Glenn. There's a lot of detail, more detail than I like to put on a single slide on this. What I have put up here is the life cycle that many TPRM or customer focused processes go through, and you go through these as well in terms of the diligence. You're both diligencing the customers, and they are diligencing your security practices to see where we have disconnects, where are we exposed on our technologies and our IP, and where does the customer have exposure. Then there's the contracting and onboarding phase where, we're determining what standards the parties are going to hold themselves to with regard to those security standards. Relationship status quo, which is, again, the continuing care and feeding of those standards. There may be audits that go on between the parties, both audit in the way that the customer is using the technology and vice versa. They're auditing our practices, our potential collection of data. Incident, we hope never to be in the incident bucket up there in the far top right, but should there be an incident, again, that all needs to feed into this preventative life cycle. What have we learned from it? What can we contractual put into a contract or update the contracts to hold each other to higher standards or differing standards based on what has happened. Renewals are always a juncture in the relationship where, again, cyber comes up. I mean, it's always coming up at each of these touch points, but it typically does come up at cyber. I mean, at renewal, because that is, another point in time in the future when if the standards have not been kept up to par with what's gone on in industry and in the market, the parties are updating the requirements then. And then end of relationship, there are potential significant risks at the end of a relationship when there's disposition and that separation and return of information and so forth. The risks are there and are heightened so that the parties need to manage to that as well. Next slide. So what provisions in an agreement invoke cyber? This is just the snapshot, and I'm sure we could have quickly come up with these without much thought at all. They come up have touch points nearly in every element of the agreement, but these are the biggies. So obviously, confidentiality and data protection standards. So those portions of the agreement, the parties articulate the standards to which they're going to hold one another. And I'll get into this. This is actually the last bullet on here. There is typically a detailed or robust security addendum or security schedule that gets appended to an agreement. Whose security standards are adhered to or become the bar for the agreement, it will differ based on the technology and based on the industry and so forth. So it is equally important that customers put out their security standards, but the same for you as providers of technology have your security standards, because by and large, you need harmonization across what you're managing to and what you're managing your technologies to, and customers recognize that. I have seen a large trend in, initially it was as a customer, our security standards, we must have these followed. That's sort of end of story. Come and coalesce around what we do, but that has changed. There is a recognition now that, in fact, many providers are doing it better, or they know their technology, they know what those standards should be, what's cutting edge, what's best practice in that area. So customers are looking to their service providers' security standards to really be the gold standard. So I make note of that, because that was when I did start my career. That's been a real sea change from the way security standards were handled in an agreement, in terms of customers forcing theirs upon a provider, and now we've definitely seen a pendulum shift. The rest, I'm going to just gloss over a few of these. They're very self-explanatory. There's background checks, all the personnel-related points. Disaster recovery and business continuity is critical. Compliance with law clauses. all of the myriad of state laws, federal laws, international laws, they all need to be accounted for within that larger compliance with laws section. And we typically see a subsection within there. There are very few topics within the law that get a subsection in an agreement on the specific laws related to it. Cyber privacy always typically does have its own special place in an agreement where it's called out explicitly. Audit, obviously from a customer standpoint, critical as part of that cycle, that loop I talked about, that life cycle. Insurance, which I'm racing along here so that we can get plenty of time with Tamara, and she'll talk in more detail about the cyber insurance aspect. And then the biggies, indemnities and limitations of liability. So this is really the sticking point in contractual negotiations around who bears accountability and responsibility at the end of the day for when an incident does occur. And a lot of detail is put into parsing out, were reasonable measures taken, put in place and accounted for? Were those security standards that we agreed to up front abided by? And, who was negligent? Who was grossly negligent? Customers do not look or should not be looking to their service providers as an insurer of cyber. So I've outsourced, I've sent this, I've procured this technology. I don't need to worry about it. That's not the case. Customers have an equal piece of the pie, a piece of, accountability in the event of incidents. And that's where so much of the work that needs to go into limitations of liability and indemnities comes into play. It's that it is not a clear passing of the baton when contracts are entered into that the service provider suddenly bears accountability. The customer has equal responsibility, and finding that dividing line as to how to allocate that risk is truly the friction and really where the time is spent on the cyber provisions. Okay, last slide. And I'm just going to, go back to the key takeaway message, which is the prevention, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, in that the focus and the trend is that it is not a static upfront discussion on cyber. It is throughout the relationship, and the market is going to continue to evolve, including finding ways in which those contracts and those mechanisms related to cyber are continuously updated from where we were at the very beginning of a relationship. So I am going to pause. I did a lot of talking. Happy to take questions now or at the end. Otherwise, I will turn this over to Tamara.
Just a quick question, Megan. You talked about contractually limiting liability, but wouldn't the other side, claim negligence? You didn't have the right precautions put in place, and therefore, it's not a liability issue; it's a negligence issue, and therefore I'm coming after you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. But this goes back to the fact that a customer can't look to the service provider to be their insurer, right? Unlimited liability because I was negligent related to my cyber practices. That just, across the market, there is no longer an acceptance that that's the practice. There has to be some cap at which we say, I did the best I could. There was a slip fall, but my liability is still capped. Now, if I'm grossly negligent, if I'm trying to think of an instance that would be so horrific that
you don't require passwords.
Yeah, my password was password.
Right. I publish the passwords on my internet site. Yeah. We've never patched anything. That is when sort of the bar falls off, and the customer can take the service provider down, because there's full exposure there for those situations.
Got it. So the key is gross negligence.
The key is gross negligence, but the key is also when you're negotiating and talking about where those limitations of liability need to lie. the service provider and both of the parties need to understand this is the expectation, right? We've put these security standards in place. This is the expectation and the bar. If you do this, that's all we can expect of you, right? I can't expect anything more from you. So there's a point at which anything above that, if you've met those criteria, you simply can't, it's very difficult to hold the service provider accountable in those circumstances.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so moving on to talking about cyber insurance is another way to help protect from some of these potential liabilities. My colleagues, Brian and other folks will raise the specter of, the liability and regulatory issues that can come out in connection with cybersecurity. And then we come in from the policyholder side insurance area to see how we can protect against those risks in the event that they happen. And as Brian mentioned, they will, because we've reached the point where it's a win, not if situation for cyber intrusions and other cyber incidents, as opposed to believing that things can be fully protected. So I'm Tamara Bruno. I am the Texas lead for the insurance recovery practice at Pillsbury, and we have a huge, insurance recovery, one of the largest in the country, an insurance recovery practice. We represent policyholders only. It means we don't represent insurance companies, and so our motives are always pure, and we do not have conflicts in that regard. And I personally do a lot of work with cyber coverage, which has evolved cyber coverage claims and placing cyber coverage and advising folks on cyber insurance issues, which has been evolving significantly, especially in the last few years pre-COVID and then during the last couple of years during COVID. So where are we at with respect to cyber insurance? Part of what's interesting about insurance is everybody uses it, right? Not for all risks necessarily, and there are different ways to shift risks, but kind of like Megan was talking about, there's a buyer side and a services provider side. When it comes to insurance, the kind of angles that you would look at cyber insurance can differ a little if you're talking about the customers versus service providers. But it's important, I think, for you all as service providers to know what is available to your customers and what you may be able to require them to have. So where are we at right now with the market? If we can go to the first slide on the insurance section. Coverage for cyber risks, it's a hard insurance market. Why? It's because of all the things that Brian brought up in the beginning of the presentation. We've been having an increasing number of cyber incidents. The risk is significant. Some insurance companies, when cyber coverage first started, insurance companies loved it because it's like, wow, there's a whole new area of the market we can go out and sell. And so insurance companies were underwriting cyber policies, pretty freely. They didn't have a great sense of the risk, and it was a pretty soft market because they wanted to capture as much market share as possible, and claims were getting paid out pretty regularly. The underwriting, though, was the concern, right? They couldn't really get a handle on the risk. They started to get a handle on the risk. The underwriting became much easier. But then with this surge in cyber incidents and increasing risk, they're looking at the cybersecurity situation for different companies and don't want to underwrite significant portions of the existing risk. And to the extent they will underwrite it, it's at higher premiums, more limited terms. There's definitely been a hardening of the cyber insurance market, especially in the last couple of years with COVID. There's been a hardening of the insurance markets overall because there's been a lot of risk that the insurance companies were prepared for or want to claim that they weren't covering in connection with COVID. And so with that and the increased cyber incidents, it's been a very challenging cyber insurance market lately. So obtaining a dedicated cyber insurance policy can actually be a challenge right now, and getting one at a reasonable rate or reasonable terms can be a challenge right now, especially if the organization is on the smaller side. If they haven't had existing cyber coverage. We were talking about Colonial. I'm based in Houston. I've been spending the last 6-7 years telling pipeline companies, you really want to be protected against cyber issues and you really want to get cyber insurance. You don't want to be the first one hit. And they just didn't really think that they were much of a target. So you have a lot of companies who just didn't have cyber coverage. And if you haven't had it in the past when the market was softer, it rather than renewing now when we're in a harder market on with a history with an insurance company and potentially better terms, they can have a harder time getting into the market. Companies that handle a lot of personal information or in higher targeted industries can also have trouble getting dedicated cyber coverage. One workaround through that can be covering cyber risks through a captive insurer. Of course, that's essentially covering it. It's more or less self-insurance, but with a different name depending on how reinsurance is set up. So that's not always pushing off the actual risk. Sometimes it is if you're having it reinsured, but oftentimes it isn't. So if we can take a look at the next slide, what can you do about the situation if there's a challenge in getting dedicated cyber coverage? Can you rely on your existing policies? The answer to that at this point is pretty much categorically no. Some courts, you'll see we had a decision last year, a good decision here in Texas in the Fifth Circuit for Landry's, finding cyber coverage under a more general traditional policy program, but it's never going to happen without a fight. And more insurance companies are putting in cyber exclusions because there has been, well, in part because it helps avoid these disputes, but also because there's also been a push from markets, particularly the Lloyd's market, for insurers to be very specific and to not fall into this so-called silent cyber trap, which is to put in cyber exclusions. So you're likely to see those in your more traditional policies. So hard to get dedicated cyber insurance. Do not want to rely on traditional insurance policies. It's pretty much the situation in the market right now. And if we move on to the next slide, we can also see in connection with that where we're at with respect to underwriting. So as I mentioned, there used to be pretty strict underwriting for cyber coverage because insurance companies weren't very comfortable with the risk. Then it became much more lenient and pretty much, hey, as long as you don't have an active cyber incident, then you're likely to be able to get cyber coverage, and insurance companies are likely to take that risk. The pendulum has now swung back, and so underwriting for cyber insurance has gotten much more challenging lately, with more in-depth questions, more complicated questions. This means that a couple of things, careful responses are needed to broader technical questions. If, as you see here, there have been cases where cyber insurance has been actually rescinded for failure to answer questions accurately. But if the questions are really broad, or if they're really open-ended, or if whoever is responding to the underwriting questions doesn't have a really solid sense of the technology and how it works or how often it's updated. Brian mentioned patches. If there's a question about, do you always patch on the schedules recommended by the software providers, you say, yeah, we always do that. But, sometimes the patches come in and it's expected to be a quick turnaround, but that's not something that's practical. Well, then have you lied on your insurance application? Lied. An insurance company will very often take a look at an answer to a question like that and may go back and say, yeah, this policy, the terms, it would fall within coverage, but there isn't coverage because of some issue with respect to an underwriting question. So that's the short story with all of that is that it's a difficult market to get dedicated cyber coverage. There are a lot of pitfalls and challenges on the way. And so, what does that mean for you all? Well, it's pretty clear what it means for you all with respect to consumers of insurance. And if you go into your own cyber policies, I'm sure you're facing many of the same situations that all our clients are facing with respect to dedicated cyber, and perhaps even more so given the risk factors involved in providing these technology services. But I think what it also means, and I think we talk about this on the next slide if we want to move to the next one. This is explain what coverages are available under policies, but just to put a button on the market, what that means for you guys too is with respect to these contract terms that Megan's been talking about, limitations of liability, and then provisions in the contract itself that may require your clients to obtain cyber insurance, for example. You want to have those in there, right? It's much better for you guys if your clients have their cyber risk underwritten and protected from the downside by an insurance company, but you also have to be careful what you're asking for. We've now been seeing a number of situations where, smaller technology company gets a services contract and the cyber insurance provision, the requirements aren't actually available in the market to those companies. So that's something to be aware of and to know, well, okay, we might want to ask for $5 million of cyber insurance, but there's going to be a $5 million retention. And is that really, exposure that you're aware of with respect to the policy requirements in the actual services contract? Where the coverage is available, as shown here, that's pretty broad. Cyber policy terms have become, they're not standard by any means, but they have become more consistent over the course of the last few years. Most of them will cover both first-party costs, so the costs of getting your data back or recreating data, costs of repairing the networks, replacing some hardware that's been perhaps made inoperable, those kind of first-party direct costs, but then also third-party liability costs for claims relating to exposure of personal information, but also claims relating to outages, that was more of an issue perhaps with the service providers. On the regulatory side, Brian noted all the increasing regulation in connection with cyber, but note some policies cover those regulatory claims, but some policies may not, or some policies may cover certain regulatory fines, but not all do. The policy terms are actually pretty variable, and so it's really worth it if you haven't and you're looking at your own dedicated cyber insurance to go through and really make sure you understand the coverages and what all is available and match that with your risks, because that's the biggest issue that we see when we come to help a client with a cyber coverage claim is often, and this is the case not just with cyber coverage, but with cyber coverage as well, is that the terms don't always match what it really is that the company is doing or what risks they were really exposed to. And so then, there can be surprise when it comes to an actual claim that the terms aren't what the insured thought was covered. Moving on to the next slide. So from your guys' perspective, are your clients going to be covered if there's an outage of cloud computing services? This was actually an issue for a while because for years, the definition of what computer systems were covered didn't always include and sometimes specifically excluded cloud computing. That's really not the case so much anymore. Most cyber insurance policies now do include coverage for interruption of cloud computing systems that are operated for the insureds. So essentially defining the insured's computing systems to include computer systems and software that is being operated or maintained on their behalf by a third party, like some folks here. On the next slide. And then the way you see that play out is essentially that while there may be exclusions for other services that are provided to insureds, like it's very standard to have, this one's called an infrastructure outage, sometimes they're called service interruption exclusions, to have exclusions to cover events where there's things like power outages. Now most policies take out of that exclusion or accept from that exclusion the provision of technology services, the provision of cloud computing or anything involving a shared computer system. Next slide, please. So that's a good news from your guys' perspective, because that means that if your clients have cyber coverage that should actually respond to an outage, for example, of cloud computing services to their system. And the other thing that's helpful is most cyber policies also waive subrogation if the insured previously agreed in writing to waive subrogation. So along with the other indemnity terms that Megan was talking about, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but it is really important to have a waiver of subrogation in your contracts with your clients, because that way, to the extent that their damages are covered by their cyber policy and they actually, receive recovery for that, the insurance company isn't going to be coming after you guys. And so these cyber insurance requirements in your service policies can really be significant protection. But as I mentioned, they should be realistic for the market. And you're just kind of setting up the contract for failure if there's a cyber insurance requirement that the client can't actually get. And also, how do you know? Well, you need to get evidence from your client, and usually this is a form of like a certificate of insurance, right, that shows that the policy's been purchased in the very basic terms, like the limit of liability and the retention, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot about what specific coverages are available. So if you have a really significant client that's a significant enough portion of your business that say an outage results in a suit from them could really harm the company, you may also want to ask to see a copy of the policy as well. If we go to the next slide. And so what are the things to look out for your own policies if you have your own dedicated cyber coverage? As a technology services company, the definition of technology services, really important. It's interesting because for you guys, it's typically going to be well drafted, because technology services definitions are now typically defined to include things like developing and operating computer systems and software for others. Other technology companies are actually finding this to be a problem, because they buy a policy and they think they have third-party liability. And because they use technology to provide a different service, like say an insurance report for property damage, or they use their technology to provide online sales platform usage, or payment processing, things that don't actually fall within the definition of technology services. So while you guys should be covered to that extent for your own policies, and that can be an issue, for example, for your clients. Covered business interruption. More and more cyber policies the insurers are trying to avoid outsized risk by actually narrowing what covered business interruption there is. And this is really problematic for technology companies, because often it might become narrowed to, for example, exclude internal costs. So if you use your internal folks to help recover from an incident, that may not be covered. Or the way profit and loss is calculated may not include certain elements that would traditionally be included in a business interruption. You find yourself with a much smaller claim than you'd expect. Something to take a look for. Also, the definition of privileged information, which is also often focused on consumer information. And if the concern is not really so much about exposing people's credit card numbers, but that you have confidential or private information from your clients that are a business, that may not actually clearly fall within the definition of privileged information. So that's another policy term to really take a look at for your all's business. And to do that, you may just want to consider having your policies reviewed to make sure that they don't fall into some of these pitfalls. I think that's it on my end, and just about right on time. So any other questions on any of the topics, either coverage issues or anything Brian or Megan talked about?
One thing that makes our members unique, I think, is the exposure that we have because we provide phone service. Specifically 911. If the phone service is down and there's an emergency and 911 can't be reached, it adds a whole nother, I think, level of liability to our providers that typical cybersecurity insurance might not cover?
Yeah, that could be a concern because that would be like an incoming wire service. And so your client's policy probably excludes outage of phone service, at least on the cyber side. Now, so that is something that could potentially be covered under their like more general property damage, business interruption. Sometimes you can get that, sometimes you can't. But if you're providing a significant amount of those services to particular clients, I think that's someplace where you'd really want to look carefully at some of the contractual protections that Megan was talking about, because your clients are much less likely to be covered for that under their cyber policies. Absolutely.
And you also, you mentioned that, obtaining this type of insurance is not easy these days. Where do we go? What do we do? Can Pillsbury help us with that?
Well, we can help to a certain extent, but what we do is we work with brokers. We work with your insurance broker because they're really the ones who know the market. They have the relationships with the insurance companies to determine what coverage is available, for your particular market segment and at what prices. But what we can do and what we often do is come in and work with the brokers to help evaluate the different options and see which ones most closely match your business and, to the extent that there's a premium you want to pay for, what you're getting, what you're giving up to give you a better sense of that. But the brokers really are the ones that have the market connections to be able to actually get you quotes.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Scott Helms, Scott, are you still with us? Yeah, I see you there. If you want to turn on your webcam and ask that question, that's regarding Yealink. That's a good one.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're kind of struggling with is some of the supply chain issues that we have specific to communications providers. Yealink is probably a name that everybody on the meeting is familiar with as a participant anyway, and is a really common device. But we're now seeing reports, and there's actually been some work done that's been forwarded to the Commerce Department that indicates that they could, at a minimum, be a risk to privacy, similar to kind of how EU customers in the GDPR covered areas look at US law enforcement intelligence agencies. We look kind of in askance at the PRC in the same way. And I wanted to see how you might think we would potentially kind of handle a third-party risk like that. Our customers are almost never going to be aware of this kind of problem. And, if we're bringing in a Yealink or, whatever the manufacturer is, how can we protect ourselves best from this kind of a risk?
Yeah, I'll say from the coverage side, it's kind of immaterial what leads up to the outage, right? So doesn't really matter whether it's your system or if the problem came through third party. I will say that once something becomes as well known as that, you have the insurance companies immediately want to put in exclusions. So the minute any of these like high profile problems with particular softwares or problems with particular companies come in, the next thing that you see is the first cyber insurance policies that come out of that have a specific exclusion for X. So that's something to look out for from the coverage side. But otherwise, I think I'd probably pass that question then over to Brian, if you have any thoughts on.
Yes.
And Brian, before you answer that, just to be clear, I don't think Scott was talking about outage as much as the leaking of information, passing on to the People's Republic of China, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a huge issue, obviously, right? I mean, Yealink versus Huawei, and all those companies are known to be, well, not Yealink specifically, but this is a well-known concern about the infrastructure leading to leakage of information because of vulnerabilities, preloaded malware, et cetera. I think what you're going to need to do is have a very well-defined mitigation plan in place and make sure that you document how you're going to mitigate that risk and that known risk, and document why alternative providers were insufficient, right? If you're really only buying the Chinese product simply because it's the cheapest, I think that you're putting yourself at risk ultimately from a regulatory and from a private litigation perspective. But if you can document why it is really the most appropriate to utilize that and the mitigation plans are going to be implemented in order to do that, I think that's really going to be the best way to go forward, and make sure that you continually pay attention to the risks that are out there and have a plan in place to replace those systems that could be problematic if it does indeed become too problematic at a later date.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the big challenge we see is just trying to get other handsets with the global chip shortage has been really hard.
Right. And that's why a lot of countries aren't going to 100% ban on Huawei as of yet, for instance, because there just aren't necessarily any alternatives. And when they do come up, I think you're going to want to consider, is it time to replace? But if you're stuck with that situation, then again, you want to put that mitigation plan in what you're doing and isolating it, and making sure it only has certain capabilities, whether you want to call it whitelisting or blacklisting, whatever the case may be. Make sure not only that you do that, but you document in the document the reason for that, so that you can produce that in case anyone asks a question.
Great. Well, all right, we ran a little bit over today, probably because I talked too much, but I want to thank Pillsbury, Brian, Megan, Glenn, Tamara. Thank you all very much for putting this together today. We're going to be sharing the PowerPoint as well as the video later today with everybody and everybody who registered. And again, thank you, Pillsbury. You guys are great partners. A plug for Vaughn too. Glenn, I think Vaughn is doing a fantastic job, and thank you for all your efforts in that respect as well. You all have a great day.
Great, my pleasure.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.